When someone claims to be an authority on a specific subject, it's only natural to want to know their credentials or their references. So what were Jesus' credentials? How can we know if what he said was reliable? That's our subject today on Truth for Life, as Alistair Begg presents a message titled, The Authority of Jesus.
We're going to read this morning from the Gospel of Mark and chapter 11, verse 27. They arrived again in Jerusalem, and while Jesus was walking in the temple courts, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders came to him. "By what authority are you doing these things?" they asked, "and who gave you authority to do this?" Jesus replied, "I will ask you one question. Answer me, and I will tell you by what authority I am doing these things. John's baptism, was it from heaven or from men? Tell me." They discussed it among themselves and said, "If we say from heaven," he will ask, "then why don't you believe him? But if we say from men," they feared the people, for everyone held that John really was a prophet. So they answered Jesus, "We don't know." Jesus said, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." Thanks be to God for his word. Father, help us now as we look to the Bible. May the Spirit of God be our teacher. We earnestly pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, let's just be very honest to begin with. We don't like other people interfering in our lives, commanding our attention, demanding our obedience. Generally speaking, we don't really like people telling us what to do at all. And not least of all in matters spiritual, because many of us have imbibed the contemporary concept of spirituality being a very personal and private thing. Matters that are known only to us and to be concerned with by ourselves and no one else's business at all. And it may well be that that is the way in which you view your reading of the Bible. And if you do, then presumably you have found our studies in Mark to be distinctly unsettling, because it becomes quickly clear that Jesus interferes in our lives for our good, but nevertheless interferes. It's for that reason that C.S. Lewis, in his little autobiography, Surprised by Joy, actually refers to Jesus at one point as the transcendental interferer. The reason that he has come is to interfere. And when we read the record of the Gospel of Mark, we discover that that is exactly what Jesus is doing. When he calls the crowd to him in chapter 8, he calls them to a revolution. He doesn't say, "If any of you are remotely interested in this, if you would like to be marginally concerned about me." No, he says, "If anyone would come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his life, keep his life for himself, will lose it. But whoever gives his life away, loses his life for me and for the gospel, will save it." Now here's the question. Does Jesus have the authority to make that kind of statement? Does Jesus have the authority to speak to the crowds in his day and to the crowds of contemporary American society and throw down such a gauntlet? If you want to save your life, you'll lose it. If you lose your life for the gospel and for me, you will save it. It's certainly not marginal. It's impossible to avoid. And it's particularly challenging for those of us who've grown up in the school of believing that we are actually the captain of our own fate, that we are the masters of our own destiny, that we have an unconquerable soul, as Henley puts it in his famous poem. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. And I don't want Jesus or anybody else interfering with that. Thank you very much. Now you see that the issue in the passage that we read is just such an issue. The struggle that is taking place between the religious authorities and Jesus is a struggle, a tussle about authority. Authority. This is not something new. It hasn't popped up out of nowhere. Because from the very beginning of the ministry of Jesus, as Mark records it, this question of authority has been a thorn in the side of the religious teachers. And I want you just to see this so that you can confirm that it's there by turning back to chapter 1. And when Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach, Mark records, that is the end of verse 21 of Mark 1, the people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority and not as the teachers of the law. So the distinguishing feature that marked him out was that he said things in such an authoritative way that they couldn't be sidestepped, they couldn't be simply dismissed. The people had been fairly routinely used to listening to the mumbo-jumbo of the religious formalism that they had come to expect. They made their way through the services, presumably. The synagogue went as per usual. But when this man, this Galilean carpenter, began to speak, suddenly it impinged upon them in a way that was quite amazing. And on that particular occasion, as Mark records, when there is a demonic encounter, when an evil spirit calls out, Jesus actually deals with that. And once again, in verse 27, Mark says the people were all so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching?" And here we go again, and with authority. And with authority. You see, these fellows were the purveyors of established religion. These fellows came from the right background. They had had the proper training. They were, if you like, credentialed. And therefore, they believed with a measure of legitimacy that it was their prerogative to ensure that nothing went wrong in terms of Judaism while on their watch. And that's why they didn't like this pseudo-rabbi, because he didn't come from the right background. He hadn't attended the right schools. He didn't possess the necessary credentials. And in chapter 6, Mark records that on another occasion when Jesus is speaking with such authority, the folks begin to say to one another, "Isn't this the carpenter's son? Don't we know his brothers and his sisters? How is it then that he speaks with such authority?" And what the people understood, the religious leaders couldn't miss. So, for example, he exposes their hypocrisy when they accuse his followers of breaking the Sabbath as a result of eating grains of corn as they walk through the fields. That's at the end of chapter 2. And in chapter 3, again in the synagogue, when a man appears with a shriveled hand that no one has been able to address, Jesus then calls him forward because he knows that the Pharisees are in the synagogue looking for a reason to accuse him. We'll be able to catch him out on this occasion, they say. And they wanted to see if he would heal the man on the Sabbath. What unbelievable selfishness and hostility is represented in taking a disabled person and using the disabled person as a mechanism for trying to catch out Jesus. So Jesus brings the man forward, realizing what's going on. He understands the plot. And he says to the assembled group, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill?" The answer is obvious. And what is their reply? But they remained silent. They knew the answer. They just couldn't give it. Because if they gave it, they condemned themselves. And Jesus looked around in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, and he healed the man. And the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. We could go through the whole of Mark. You say, "Well, we've done that already. Please don't do that now." Well, that's okay. That's fair. I accept that. But just one more then, because what I'm trying to show you is that this little encounter here, the pot has been boiling underneath it for some considerable time before this confrontation takes place, before this delegation emerges. So, for example, in chapter 7, again, the Pharisees have come. They've challenged Jesus and the disciples. They're not washing their hands properly. They're not cleaning the utensils properly. They're not observing the traditions of the elders. That's verse 5 of chapter 7. Why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders? And Jesus says, you know what? The prophet Isaiah was right about you folks when he said, you people honor me with your lips, but your hearts are far from me. You worship me in vain. Your teachings are but rules taught by men. It is entirely external, he says. And you're missing the whole point, because you're the ones who have let go the commands of God for the traditions of men. You have, he says, a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. And I resist any temptation to make application of that as I'm going along. So with all of that said, by way of background, let's come back to the passage that is before us. There again in Jerusalem, the place to which Jesus is moving, where he will suffer and die at the hands of cruel men, as he said, be crucified, and on the third day rise again. The momentum is building. Jesus is walking in the temple courts, we're told by Mark. By Matthew, in his account, he says Jesus is teaching in the temple courts. Therefore, we know that Jesus was teaching as he was walking and walking as he was teaching. And as the crowd gathered around him, and as the people listened to him, this little coterie of the religious establishment show up. And their confrontation is pretty straightforward. It seems to be an official representation of the Sanhedrin, three component parts of the religious authorities: the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders. Now, presumably they'd put their wooden heads together and decided that they would try and trap him with just one good question. And it must have been with a measure of anticipation and smugness that they came to ask, as is recorded in verse 28, by what authority are you doing these things, they asked, and who gave you authority to do this? Because after all, as we've noted, they were the ones that had the authorization. They were the ones that had the schooling. They were the ones that had the background. They knew that he had none of this. He was from the carpenter's shop in Nazareth. He was a pseudo-rabbi. So let's just ask him. We'll just say to him, so where did you get your authority? I wonder, did they think they'd trapped him, nailed him as a result of this? And if so, how short-lived would that experience have been? Because Jesus gets them in his counter-question. It's a fairly Hebraic way of response. Lawyers understand this kind of thing. And when I read this, it made me think of the man who invented radar. You say, well, we know that your mind is fairly warped, but how do you get from here to Sir Robert Watson Watt, who invented radar, a Scotsman who invented radar? Well, it's always annoyed me that every time I get a speeding ticket, I think of the character. But it was a wartime invention. They gave him $140,000 for it, the highest award ever made for a wartime invention. But unfortunately, while the Scotsman was driving in Canada, he was actually caught for speeding in a radar trap. And being a relatively humorous sort of soul, he wrote a little doggerel concerning that, which goes as follows: "Pity Sir Robert Watson Watt, strange target of his radar plot, and thus, with others I could mention, a victim of his own invention." And that is exactly what this proves to be for these religious folks. They are victims of their own invention. Because what we know about them from the reading of the gospel is that they were motivated not by a desire for everything to be streamlined in the way that they might desire, but rather they were motivated by envy. By the time Jesus is brought before Pilate, Pilate, despite his own equivocation, is a shrewd judge of character. And so when he speaks to these folks, he says to them, "Would you like me to release for you the King of the Jews?" And then Mark says, because Pilate knew that the only reason they had handed him over was on account of envy. Envy. Envy is the reverse, is the flip side of the coin of vanity. When I'm envious, it's because I'm vain. It's because I'm proud that I would be envious of anyone who can outdo me. If I am humble, then I can rejoice in the success of another, or the giftedness of another, or the extent of the crowd that is gathering to listen to another. But if I am envious, it basically says that I'm proud and I think that more people should be listening to me than are listening to him or listening to her or whatever it might be. And that's what was going on with these characters. They were full of pride. Proud about their religious background, proud about their credentials, proud about the way everything had gone along. And now this upstart rabbi shows up and everybody's listening to everything he says and following him in great numbers. No, you see, Jesus is now going to set them on their heels by asking them in response. Well, he says, I'll ask you a question. You answer me, and then I'll tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. John's baptism, was it from heaven or from men? Tell me. Why, of all things, would he say this? Well, the way to make sure we understand is by understanding the relationship between John the Baptist and Jesus. And the prologue of John's Gospel is as helpful as any part of the Gospels in making that clear for us. So, for example, we can't read it all, but verse 6, there came a man who was sent from God, his name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light, he came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. You must read on your own. And then verse 19, now this was John's testimony when the Jews of Jerusalem sent priests and Levites to ask him who he was. Once again, the religious establishment has to find out, who is this fellow who is setting the heather on fire? Who is this strange preacher in this hot, uninhabitable depression to whom the crowds are going out day and daily? Who is this man that dresses in such a strange fashion, has such a strange diet, and yet is on the receiving end of crowds and crowds of people? We need to find out. And he did not fail to confess. But he said, well, I'll tell you who I'm not. I'm not the Messiah. So then they probe him and so on. Verse 22, who are you? Give us an answer to take back to those who sent us. What do you say about yourself? Which is, of course, a question that many of us love to have asked. We can keep people for a very long time answering that question. But John the Baptist replies, well, I'm actually a voice. I'm just calling out, preparing the way for the Lord. And the people had got that clear in their minds. They understood that John the Baptist was a prophet. Now back to verse 29. So Jesus says, well, let me ask you a question. Did John's baptism come from heaven or did it come from men? Was it divine or was it human? Verse 31, they discussed it among themselves. Well, we're just going to have a little talk amongst ourselves here. They pull away. Not a holy huddle, more like an unholy huddle. And they put their wooden heads together once again. And one of them says, well, we can't say the baptism comes from heaven, because if we say it comes from heaven, then he will want to know why we don't believe in him. Well, another one says, well, we can't say it comes from men, because The crowds are convinced that John the Baptist was a true prophet. And we need the crowds on our side if we're going to finally get rid of this pseudo-rabbi. So we daren't alienate the crowd by saying that it came from men. So one of them says, well, there's only one thing we can say. We'll just tell them we don't know. That's a flat-out lie. That is expediency ruling over truth. They know, but they can't admit what they know because it will then demand either their obedience to the lordship of Christ, or it will put them in an unfavorable position with the majority. So essentially what they do is they play politics with Jesus. Barclay says they give the lamest of all lame answers. It's impossible for them to answer otherwise without either condemning themselves or incurring the opposition of the people. So the answer, Jesus, we don't know. Jesus said, well, neither will I tell you by what authority I'm doing these things. He then began to speak to them in parables, and that's where we'll go next time. But for now, we have to stop here.
You're listening to Alistair Begg on Truth for Life and a message from our series called The Gospel According to Mark. Tomorrow will be our final day in this study, so please be sure to join us again. If you'd like a copy of all 87 messages in the complete series, The Gospel According to Mark, this entire study is available on USB for $5. Order yours when you visit truthforlife.org/store. And at this low price, you may want to get extra USBs for friends. It is a pleasure for us to provide high-quality resources like this USB for our low cost of production without any markup. We believe cost should not be a barrier to anyone who desires to learn and grow in their knowledge of Scripture. That's why we're so grateful that the overhead cost is cared for by giving from listeners like you. And if you're able to donate today, we'd love to express our thanks for your donation and the thanks of your fellow listeners by sending you a beautiful picture book titled The Garden, the Curtain, and the Cross. With Easter quickly approaching, we know there are many parents and grandparents who are looking for ways to help young children understand the remarkable story of the gospel and the significance of Easter. Explaining the concept of sin or redemption or salvation to preschoolers, that can be a challenging task. That's why we love this book, The Garden, the Curtain, and the Cross. It brilliantly explains, using language preschoolers can easily understand, how our fellowship with God was broken through Adam and Eve's disobedience, but was renewed through the cross of Christ. Plus, the illustrations in the book are unique. They're bright. They will help capture your child's attention. In fact, if you'd like to see a sample of the illustrations, there's a preview available on our website. This is a hardcover book that children will love reading for years to come, one we highly recommend you add to your library. Request The Garden, the Curtain, and the Cross when you donate today. Online at truthforlife.org/donate. Or if you'd prefer, you can give by calling 888-588-7884. You're also welcome to donate by mail. Write to Truth for Life at P.O. Box 39 8000, Cleveland, Ohio 44139. Remember to include a note requesting your copy of the children's book. I'm Bob Lepine, hoping you can join us Tuesday for the conclusion of our message titled The Authority of Jesus, as we wrap up our study of Mark's Gospel. The Bible teaching of Alistair Begg is furnished by Truth for Life, where the learning is for living.